Hey guys, tonight we are going to explore a haunting question. What could turn a 9-year-old boy, the heir to the throne of England, into one of the most devastating agents in religious history? We often view the Tudor dynasty through the lens of Henry VIII and his powerful daughters. But hidden in the shadows is the story of Edward VI, an orphaned young king, infected with fanaticism and equipped with absolute power. Imagine a child who should have been learning how to play and empathize, instead meticulously recording executions by fire in his diary. That boy believed that stripping the wealth from churches, suppressing the common people, and condemning those who believed in God differently were not crimes, but rather a divine mission from heaven. Tonight, we will trace the path of the manipulation, of the personal tragedy, and of the crisis of faith that transformed England during Edward's time into a cold, desolate battlefield. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please let me know where you are watching from and what time it is on your clock right now. I wish you a very relaxing evening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the long, dim corridors of Tudor memory, the image of a 9-year-old boy ascending the throne often carries with it a softness that never truly existed. We picture innocence, a gentle promise, a small figure stepping into a vast world with hope resting lightly on his shoulders. But with Edward VI, the truth drifted in another direction, quiet, cold, and shaped by forces far older and darker than childhood. From the moment he entered the world, every breath he drew, every whispered lesson, every adult hand that adjusted the tilt of his crown, guided him toward the belief that he was born set apart, born superior, born to rule with a divine right that allowed no questioning. He was wrapped not in affection, but in expectation so tightly that no tenderness could reach him. Edward was born on the 12th day of October in the year 1537 at Hampton Court Palace. His birth was greeted with bonfires, fireworks, and 2,000 rounds of gunfire. For Henry VIII, this infant was the long-awaited prize for years of religious revolt and personal upheaval. Henry had broken England from Rome, ended his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, sent Anne Boleyn to the scaffold, and at last, through Jane Seymour, received the legitimate son he had hungered for. But triumph came hand in hand with loss. Jane Seymour died 12 days after giving birth, disappearing from her child's life before he could ever comprehend what a mother was. He entered the world already touched by grief, a lone child surrounded by celebration he could not understand. From the start, Edward was not treated as a boy in need of affection, warmth, or guidance. He was treated as a symbol, a weapon, a future king molded for a religious war he could not begin to grasp. His education hardened around him like armor. By the time he was 6, he could read and write in Latin, Greek, and French. He studied theology not with curiosity, but with the rigid intensity of someone being shaped for a purpose. Lesson by lesson, his tutors, chosen first by his father and later by Protestant reformers, poured into him the belief that Catholicism was not merely mistaken, but dangerous, an evil, an abomination to be destroyed. No doubt was allowed to take root. No breath of empathy was permitted to soften the edges of what he was being taught. Edward grew up without companions his own age, without games or mischief echoing in palace halls, without anyone to show him that kindness was not weakness. The rooms around him were quiet, heavy with political intentions. Those who bowed before him did so not out of love, but ambition. And those who guided his mind did so with the single aim of shaping him into a tool sharper than steel. When Henry VIII died in the year 1547, England found itself trembling beneath the weight of uncertainty. The towering monarch who had dominated the kingdom for so long was gone, leaving a pale, frail boy to inherit a nation fractured by religious conflict. Edward was only 9 years old, too small for the throne, too young for the burdens placed upon him. Yet the crown was lowered onto his head all the same, and with it came the expectations of a realm desperate for direction. According to Henry's will, a council of 16 men was appointed to guide the young king, but power slips easily from written intentions into human hands. Within mere days, Edward Seymour, the boy's maternal uncle, seized control in a swift, calculated coup. He named himself Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, becoming the true ruler while Edward stood quietly in the background, a figurehead shaped by others. And from that moment, a shift settled over England like a slow-moving shadow. A delicate boy, raised without softness, taught to view mercy as a flaw and religious difference as sin, stepped into a reign that would, in time, be marked by blood and the cold certainty of righteousness. He was a child who should have been held gently, yet instead was placed at the centre of a storm, carrying in his narrow frame a zeal he believed to be holy, a certainty he believed to be divine, and a future that would be carved into his kingdom with fire, fear, and unwavering faith. Even as a young teenager, Edward was never merely a powerless figure moved across the board by stronger hands. His own writings, carefully kept in a private journal, where he recorded each event of his reign, reveal something colder, something unnervingly detached for someone so young. He listed executions as though they were changes in the weather, brief notations without emotion, without hesitation, without the slightest tremor of the human heart. And when his second uncle, Thomas Seymour, the same man who had once given him small gifts, spoken to him warmly, and tried in his flawed way to build a bond with the lonely boy king, was condemned for treason, Edward signed the death warrant without pause. No wavering pen, no second thoughts. That single act became a quiet window into his mind, showing that he truly believed anyone who stood apart from what he saw as divine truth deserved to die. England at that moment stood on fragile, trembling ground. Though the country had endured Henry VIII's break from Rome, the majority of the population still leaned instinctively toward the old Catholic faith. Many hoped that with Henry gone, the kingdom might settle, soften, or even drift slowly back toward familiar rituals and a less violent spiritual landscape. But Edward and the men ruling in his name chose another path, a harsher one. They would force reformation not through persuasion, but through absolute command and the weight of state violence. Early in Edward's reign, the most striking example of this was the introduction of the Book of Common Prayer in the year 1549. To the government, it was a step forward into Protestant uniformity. But to ordinary people, whose lives had been shaped for nearly 1,000 years by Catholic liturgy, it was a tearing apart of everything sacred. This was not a simple shift from Latin to English. It was the erasure of the rhythms that had marked baptisms, marriages, funerals, harvests, and holy days for generations. It was the sudden silencing of melodies their ancestors had sung, the disappearance of prayers whispered over the dying, the severing of a spiritual thread that had guided the English soul for centuries. And the changes did not stop with words. Soon, orders swept across the kingdom demanding the destruction of religious imagery. Stained glass windows that had survived wars and weather for hundreds of years were smashed with hammers. Statues of saints were dragged from niches and shattered on church floors. Painted screens, tapestries, carved altarpieces all reduced to ash or melted down for their precious metals. Churches that had once glowed with colour and craftsmanship became pale, hollow spaces. Their emptiness was more than physical. It was emotional, spiritual. Villagers entered these stripped sanctuaries and felt as though something living had died inside them. Fear settled deeply across the realm. People spoke cautiously, weighing every word. A nostalgic comment about the old Mass could mean an accusation. A whispered prayer in Latin could be reported. The government's reach stretched into cottages and markets, warping trust between neighbours. Children, urged to serve the new order, reported their own parents. Communities that once relied on one another now watched each other through narrowing eyes. And then came the burnings. Those who clung to Catholic rituals, priests, monks, and faithful parishioners were labelled heretics. At Smithfield, executions unfolded slowly, cruelly, designed to stun the crowd into obedience. Victims were chained to wooden stakes, surrounded by bundles of wood stacked in careful, deliberate layers. The fires were lit so that the flames rose gradually, eating their way through flesh and fabric while the condemned remained conscious. It could take half an hour or more for the body to surrender. Skin blistered, cracked, and peeled. Voices screamed until their cords burned away. Some prayed, some simply endured. All suffered. Edward knew. And Edward approved. In his journal, he noted these executions with a calm certainty that felt older than his years. To him, these deaths were not cruelty, they were God's justice, a cleansing, a necessary fire to purify the nation he believed he was born to shape. The boy king felt no conflict, no shadow of doubt. He believed utterly that he was fulfilling the will of heaven, that each body burning in the square brought England closer to divine truth. And so, guided by men who sought power and shaped by a childhood stripped of softness, Edward carried out what he believed to be sacred work, never seeing that the flames he kindled were consuming more than heresy. They were consuming the very souls of his people. In the year 1549, the quiet endurance of ordinary people in Cornwall and Devon finally reached its breaking point. These were not rebels by nature. They were farmers with weathered hands, craftsmen who shaped the daily life of their villages, labourers who rose before dawn. They did not seek to overthrow Edward VI, nor did they dream of stirring chaos. All they wanted was to keep the Mass they had known since childhood, to hear Latin rise and fall in their churches, to preserve the rituals their ancestors had passed down across generations. They wished only to hold on to something familiar in a world that was changing far too quickly. When their priests were ordered to abandon the old rite and perform the new Protestant service, villagers resisted in the only way they knew how. They pressed their priest to continue the Catholic Mass, insisting on the language and rhythm that had shaped their spiritual lives. And in just a few days, word spread across countryside and coast. Thousands joined together in what would become the Prayer Book Rebellion, arising not of ambition, but of grief. Their demands were simple, almost heartbreakingly so. They wanted the ancient Mass restored. They wanted the 6 articles of religion, the same statutes upheld under Henry VIII, returned. They wanted their holy days, their processions, their time-honoured ceremonies. And above all, they wanted the reforms to stop advancing with such punishing speed. But the government saw none of this as devotion. Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset and protector of the realm, saw only defiance. The council labelled the petitioners as traitors, not mourners, and Somerset sent Lord Russell to crush the rising, giving him an army reinforced with foreign mercenaries, Italian and German soldiers who felt no kinship with the English villagers they were ordered to face. What followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. Russell's forces tightened their grip around Exeter, laying siege to the city for 6 long weeks. Day after day, artillery tore into walls. Soldiers cut down those who tried to flee. Hunger gnawed at the defenders while fear hollowed out their courage. And when the gates finally shattered, the army poured in with merciless precision. Those who surrendered were killed where they stood. Women and children were trampled beneath cavalry horses. Homes were set ablaze, flames reaching toward the sky like burning prayers unanswered. Villagers fleeing through lanes and across fields were hunted down, cut apart, or shot as they ran. But even the fall of Exeter did not quench the fury of the king's forces. The soldiers swept across village after village, pursuing anyone connected to the rising. Some were executed simply for sheltering rebels. Others died because someone whispered their name with suspicion. And among the most haunting deaths was that of Father Robert Welsh, a priest beloved in his community. He was hanged in his vestments from the tower of his own church, forced to look down upon the land and the people he had tried to protect in his final silent moments. By the time the rebellion was extinguished, the death toll lay somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 souls, a staggering loss for a region of sparse population. Entire families were erased. Fields stood unharvested because the men who worked them were gone. Widows wandered with no one left to support them. Orphans drifted from village to village, carrying memories they were too young to understand. And far away from the cries, the smoke, and the ruin, Edward received the news. The destruction of thousands of his subjects appeared in his journal as only a few short, indifferent lines. No sorrow, no reflection, no flicker of regret. To him, it was not tragedy. It was the necessary removal of those who resisted sacred truth. And a boy, barely in his teens, recorded the deaths of thousands with the same calm tone he used to note the weather or the arrival of foreign diplomats. It was as though the suffering of the West Country existed only as numbers inked on the page numbers that, in his mind, carried the weight not of humanity but of divine justice fulfilled. And so, the fields of Cornwall and Devon grew quiet again, not with peace, but with the stillness that follows devastation. A silence heavy enough to linger for generations, and heavy enough to reveal the chilling certainty of a king who believed utterly in the righteousness of every life he allowed to be taken. In the quiet shadow of the religious violence sweeping across England, another tragedy unfolded, slow, silent, and merciless. It did not roar like rebellion or blaze like heresy trials. Instead, it crept through villages and fields, hollowing out the lives of ordinary people. This was the enclosure movement, a transformation that turned shared land into private wealth. The common lands, those broad fields where villagers had planted crops for generations, where cattle grazed freely, where families gathered firewood and secured the rhythms of survival, were seized by wealthy landowners. The new hunger for wool, for sheep, for profit that multiplied quickly, drove the gentry to fence off what had once belonged to communities. Within a few short years, thousands of villages disappeared from the map. The families who had lived on the same soil for century after century were forced away, driven from their homes with no place waiting for them. They walked the roads with bundles on their backs, carrying memories rather than belongings, because belongings were too heavy for a life suddenly uprooted. Towns could not absorb them. There were not enough jobs. Food prices rose sharply as harvests shrank and fields fell into the hands of sheep instead of people. Unemployment spread like a stain across the countryside, and then the bodies began to appear. Chronicles from the era describe heartbreaking scenes along England's highways. The elderly lying still beneath hedgerows, infants cradled in the arms of mothers who had long since gone cold, abandoned women collapsing alone on the roadside. Some starved to death, slowly. Some died of cold when the night wind found them without shelter. Others succumbed to disease that preyed on weakened bodies thinned by hunger. There are accounts of entire families sleeping inside drainage ditches, using damp earth as their bed. Children were seen chewing grass, bark, or whatever their hands could reach, their stomachs shrinking with each passing day. And through all of this, the state did nothing to save them. Instead of compassion, it offered punishment. Under Edward's government, anyone without work was labelled a vagabond, a criminal, not a victim. The first offence meant being branded with a hot iron and condemned to 2 years of slavery. Repeat offenders were to be executed by hanging. These laws did not distinguish between the lazy and the desperate. They did not care whether someone had once owned a home, ploughed a field, or raised a family. Displacement itself became a crime. During Edward's 6-year reign, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 villages were dissolved or abandoned through enclosure. Tens of thousands of people lost their land, their identity, their place in the world. Famine and disease settled heavily over the countryside, raising child mortality to levels the kingdom had rarely seen. Small graves filled the churchyards, often without markers, without names, without prayers spoken aloud in fear of attracting unwanted attention. Reports reached London again and again, describing starvation, riots, and communities buckling under the weight of despair. Somerset felt a glimmer of concern, enough to propose mild reforms. But the Privy Council, composed almost entirely of wealthy landowners, resisted every change. They were enriching themselves with each acre taken, each village erased, each family driven away. To them, enclosure was not tragedy, it was opportunity. Every human cost became another line of profit in their ledgers. And Edward? His journal remained untouched by any mention of the suffering beyond palace walls. No entry about the starving families, no reflection on the villages swallowed by fences, no flicker of awareness that children were dying in ditches while he was taught Greek declensions and theological certainties. In his mind, the kingdom's pain lay far below the divine height he believed he occupied. He had been shaped to see himself as chosen by God, a vessel of sacred authority, untouched by the needs of ordinary souls. To him, the cries of the poor were distant, muted, as though they belonged to another world entirely, a world he did not have to understand, a world he did not have to save. Thus, as flames consumed heretics in the city and fences consumed villages in the countryside, Edward wrote calmly in his journal, his pen steady, his heart untouched. And across England, countless lives withered quietly, never recorded, never mourned, held only in the heavy silence of a kingdom turning its face away. Under Edward's rule, England entered a chapter of devastation so methodical, so sweeping, that even the destruction wrought by Henry VIII seemed restrained by comparison. If Henry had shattered the monasteries, Edward presided over something colder, a calculated campaign of religious asset, stripping that reached into every parish, every guild, every corner of spiritual life. It was one of the most ruthless seizures of church wealth in European history, carried out not against distant monastic estates, but against the very communities that had sustained England for centuries. The targets were clear: parish churches, chantries, the sacred endowments whose priests offered prayers for the dead, guilds, the organizations that preserved skills, supported charity, and tied neighbours together through shared ritual. These institutions formed the backbone of English religious and social life, and under Edward, they were dismantled piece by piece. The government announced noble intentions. They claimed the wealth taken from churches would be used for education and charity. New schools would rise, hospitals would flourish, the poor would be cared for. But the truth unfolded very differently. Most of the treasure disappeared into the pockets of councillors, nobles, and those who stood closest to power. What had been given over generations by ordinary families, the heirlooms of faith, became private riches for a select few. Commissioners travelled across the kingdom, carrying detailed inventories of what must be confiscated. They entered churches with cold efficiency, opening cupboards, prying open chests, climbing towers, searching beneath altars. No object was too sacred or too humble to escape their lists. Golden chalices, silver patens, yevilled monstrances seized, vestments embroidered with gold thread taken from sacristies and piled like discarded cloth. Statues of saints smashed open to see where the gold leaf hid beneath the paint. Paintings and altar screens burned, hacked apart, or sold to foreign buyers who dealt in sacred art. Bells pulled down from towers and melted. Ancient manuscripts torn for their bindings, their pages turned to waste. Even brass memorial plates, engraved with generations of names, were pried from tombs and carted away. In a few short years, hundreds of churches were stripped bare. What had once glowed with stained glass, flickering candlelight, painted walls, carved angels, and embroidered cloth became empty, echoing shells. The spiritual warmth that had comforted communities for nearly 1,000 years was scraped away, leaving cold stone where memory once lived. Parishioners described these altered spaces as though their very souls had been torn from the walls. The dissolution of chantries struck an even deeper blow. These institutions had funded village schools, employed teachers, supported hospitals, and provided alms for the poor. They had cared for the vulnerable long before the idea of a state welfare system existed. When the government dissolved them, these supports vanished overnight. And this happened precisely when England needed help the most, when enclosure created thousands of homeless families, when famine and disease stalked the countryside, when whole communities were collapsing under economic strain. Guilds, too, were dismantled. These organizations, which had nurtured trades, preserved cultural traditions, sponsored festivals, and offered social support, were erased in the name of religious purification. Without them, villages lost not only their artisans, but also the communal rhythms that once bound people together. The destruction of England's artistic and cultural heritage was enormous. Stained glass windows crafted by medieval masters gone. Sculptures carved by generations of craftsmen broken. Music manuscripts, illuminated texts, genealogies, parish records, lost to fire or sold abroad for a fraction of their worth. What had taken centuries to build vanished in a few ruthless years. And Edward? He benefited directly from the wealth stripped from the nation's churches. He wore jewels once offered on altars. He granted former church lands to favourites. He lived amid the splendour created by the destruction of communities that would never recover. And just as he believed the burnings were holy justice, he believed this too was God's will. In his mind, nothing was being stolen. Nothing sacred was being desecrated. He had been raised to believe that purifying the realm even through ruin, even through fire, even through the extinction of England's cultural soul was righteous. And so he watched the kingdom's treasures flow toward him, and his counsel with the serene certainty of someone who had never been taught to question the morality of power. As churches grew silent and bare, England changed in ways no ruler could ever reverse. The artistic inheritance of nearly a millennium slipped into oblivion, and the kingdom's spiritual landscape was reshaped into something stark, stripped and wounded. And the boy king, wrapped in his conviction of divine purpose, recorded none of this loss. Behind Edward's young, unlined face lay a dense web of ambitious men, each circling the throne not out of loyalty but out of hunger. Hunger for land, gold, titles, and power that could be justified only through the presence of a crowned child. To them, Edward was not a king. He was a shield, a legal seal, a convenient symbol wrapped in sanctity, and the chilling truth was that Edward did not merely endure their manipulation. He participated in it. He signed death warrants not with reluctance, but with a steady hand, as though each signature were nothing more than a ritual of sovereignty. The first victim of this political machinery was Thomas Seymour, the younger brother of Somerset. Thomas was handsome, charming, reckless, a man who could dazzle and deceive with equal ease. His marriage to the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr, without royal consent, had already drawn uneasy stares. But Thomas wanted more than affection or status. He wanted influence over the boy king. He slipped Edward coins, whispered in private, and planted suggestions that the young monarch should seize power from the council. At the same time, he behaved in alarming ways toward the Princess Elizabeth, testing boundaries that should never have been touched. His ambition had no brakes, and when it grew too loud, too dangerous, too destabilizing, the council moved swiftly. Thomas Seymour was arrested on charges of treason for plotting, for manipulation, for threatening the fragile structure that kept England from collapsing. But to kill him legally, the council needed one thing: the signature of Edward, who was only 11 years old, and the boy signed. Without reluctance, without hesitation, without a tremor of conscience. His journal recorded nothing more than a dry note about the execution. No sorrow, no reflection, no mention that a man who had once tried to befriend him had died because of his pen. On Tower Hill, Thomas Seymour's head fell beneath the axe, while Edward's daily routine continued undisturbed. Then came Somerset's turn. The same Somerset who had once been Edward's protector, his guardian, the man who had seized power immediately after Henry's death and placed himself at the head of the regency. But power was a shifting landscape, and Somerset had made enemies. His attempts to show leniency to common rebels, his ineffective management, his failure to satisfy the demands of the nobility, all painted him as weak. Waiting in the shadows was John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, who would soon become the Duke of Northumberland. Dudley was everything. Somerset was not. Ruthless, calculating, unblinking. When Somerset faltered, Dudley struck. Through political manoeuvring, whispered rumours, and strategic accusations, he orchestrated a coup that tore Somerset from the heart of power. Somerset was imprisoned, released, and then imprisoned again, a cruel dance of false mercy and tightening noose. Finally, the council declared him guilty of felony, a charge that would lead him to the scaffold. All that remained was the king's approval. And again, Edward signed. This was the man who had defended the throne for him, raised him, carried the weight of the regency through rebellion and crisis. But to Edward, the death of Somerset was simply another administrative matter. His journal spoke of it with the same sparse, clinical tone he used for weather notes or hunting outings. No grief, no acknowledgement of personal ties. Only the quiet efficiency of a monarch convinced he was enacting divine order. With Somerset gone, Dudley, now Northumberland, held the reins of England completely. He enriched himself through confiscated church treasure, seized lands, and the rewards of a system he helped carve apart. And power, once tasted, grew into ambition larger than the kingdom itself. Northumberland saw in Edward not just a king, but an opportunity to reshape the future of England. If he could manipulate the line of succession, bend its rigid laws, and place someone loyal to him on the throne after Edward's death, he could become the most powerful figure in the realm. And Edward, young yet unwavering in his Protestant conviction, became the perfect instrument for this plan. Thus began a new chapter. A quiet, deliberate attempt to rewrite the fate of a nation, guided by a child king who believed utterly in his own divine mission, and by a man who believed utterly in his right to rule through him. As Edward moved deeper into his teenage years, his fragile body began to betray him. The cough that once came and went without much concern grew persistent, tearing at his lungs. His skin turned pale, almost translucent. His frame weakened and thinned until his robes seemed to hang from him like cloth draped over a dying flame. Those who ruled through him watched each decline with quiet terror, for their power, their safety, their very lives were tied to the breath of this one sickly boy. For they all knew, if Edward died, Mary Tudor, his Catholic half-sister, would inherit the throne. And Mary, wronged, sidelined, humiliated for years, would have every reason to punish those who had shattered the old faith. The Protestant councillors did not see a queen in Mary. They saw a death sentence already written. But Northumberland, sharper and more ambitious than the rest, saw another path. Lady Jane Grey. Jane Grey, great-granddaughter of Henry VII, educated, devoutly Protestant, gentle in demeanour, but strong in conviction, and newly married to Northumberland's son, Guildford Dudley. If he could place Jane on the throne, he would protect the Protestant reforms and secure unimaginable influence for himself. But to do that, he needed Edward, not just his acceptance, but his signature, the divine authority of a king, even a dying one. And chillingly, Edward required almost no persuasion. He had long viewed Mary's Catholicism as dangerous, even sinful. He once said it would be better for Mary to die than to continue living in idolatry. This was not a political calculation for him. It was a matter of religious purity, a purity he believed heaven demanded. So the device for the succession was drafted, a document that did what no English monarch had ever attempted: overthrow the line of succession set by both Parliament and Henry VIII himself. It removed Mary. It removed Elizabeth. It placed Lady Jane Grey as heir to the throne. Edward did more than sign it. He rewrote it in his own uneven teenage handwriting, adjusting phrases, clarifying terms, closing loopholes, making certain that no one could interpret the document in a way that restored Mary's rightful claim. He did so while coughing blood, while his strength dwindled, while his life narrowed into painful breaths. Yet his devotion to Protestant supremacy remained sharp, unwavering. And while this game of succession unfolded in private chambers, the machinery of justice under Edward continued without pause. Those deemed traitors, heretics, or threats to order faced punishments, so brutal they seemed carved from nightmares, hanging until unconscious, then being cut down still alive, their stomachs sliced open, organs removed while they were aware, their bodies quartered and displayed as warnings. The common man suffered these torments. Nobles, deemed too important for public agony, usually received the quick mercy of beheading. Edward's involvement was total. His journal, the same diary where he noted the weather and diplomatic visits, listed executions with the flat precision of clerical bookkeeping. Names, dates, methods, nothing more. No reflection, no question, no tremor of conscience. The deaths of men and women became entries in the daily rhythm of a king who saw violence as a tool of divine order. To Edward, ordering executions was no different from approving a new tapestry for the palace or confirming a shipment of books. It was administrative, routine, expected. And it was precisely this tranquility, this unshaken calm in the face of blood, flames, and torn bodies that made him so unnervingly frightening. He was not cruel in sudden bursts, not prone to rage or impulsive violence. He was something colder, something quieter. A youth who believed the suffering he caused was righteous. A boy who never questioned whether pain could be wrong. A king who thought he was serving God with every life he extinguished. And in the palace corridors, as his breath grew thinner and his coughs drew deeper, the men around him pressed him to finish the succession device, for they needed Jane, and Jane needed Edward's dying hand. Outside, the kingdom waited, breath held, not knowing that the pen strokes of a fading child would soon plunge England into one of the most extraordinary crises of its history. The palace fought its battles with signatures, councils, and shifting alliances, but far beyond those guarded walls, ordinary people lived inside a tightening fist. Under Edward's rule, the kingdom did not feel ruled by a child, it felt ruled by fear itself, seeping into kitchens, markets, nighttime whispers, and the fragile quiet before sleep. For common folk, Edward's reign was not a sequence of religious proclamations. It was something much heavier, something that pressed against their ribs with every breath, a constant, living dread. Before the Reformation, life in an English village followed the rhythm of Catholic ritual. The Mass marked the weeks. Feast days marked the seasons. Bells signalled births, deaths, marriages, the hours of prayer, the turning of the year. The church was not merely a place to worship. It was the heart of time itself, a sanctuary during sickness, a comfort during loss, a reminder of continuity stretching back nearly 1,000 years. When the Mass was abolished, it felt as though time itself had been torn apart. Altars were stripped, painted walls scrubbed into dead white, statues removed, candles extinguished. Familiar hymns vanished overnight. Spaces once warm with colour and incense stood hollow and hard, echoing like tombs. Many written accounts from the era describe an atmosphere of mourning entire communities, moving as though wrapped in funeral cloth, grieving a faith that had been taken from them not by argument, but by decree. Suspicion spread like a cold mist through towns and villages. No one dared speak honestly in front of neighbours. A single wistful remark, "If only the old mass were still here," could lead to denunciation. Children were encouraged to listen at doors and windows. Wives could betray husbands, husbands betray wives. Friends looked away from each other in the market, afraid that even a greeting might become evidence. What had once been close-knit communities became webs of listening ears. Silence became the safest language, and the silence grew heavier as the economy crumbled. Food prices climbed. Work became scarce. The rending away of common lands and the collapse of church-based charity left the poor without the protections their ancestors had relied on for generations. Before Edward's reign, monasteries had fed the hungry, chantry priests had cared for the sick, and guilds had supported tradesmen and labourers. Now all of it was gone, confiscated, dissolved, buried under the language of reform. Poverty no longer inspired sympathy. It became a crime. Anyone wandering in search of food or shelter could be branded with hot iron, chained, forced into slavery for 2 years. If they were caught again, they could be hanged. Hunger became as dangerous as heresy. The poor, who had done nothing but exist in a collapsing world, found themselves blamed for their own misfortune. Children suffered most. Many were orphaned by uprisings crushed under sword and musket. Others lost parents to disease, cold, or starvation. The closing of chantry-funded schools meant that learning once within reach, even for the modestly poor, vanished. Childhood dulled into survival. No church bells marked their days, no village festivals lightened their nights. Their world held only hunger, strange new prayers, and fear of laws they did not understand. As faith, livelihood, and community structures disintegrated, despair settled into the bones of the realm. Some sought escape in drink. Others withdrew into themselves, drifting through their days like shadows. Some clung to quiet, hidden prayers, whispered rosaries said behind locked doors, Latin muttered in haylofts, old hymns hummed beneath breaths while working in the fields. They risked imprisonment, even death, to hold on to the fragments of a past that had shaped every part of their identity. And yet, even in the bleakness, small acts of humanity flickered. Villagers slipped bread to starving neighbours. Families hid forbidden objects, a small wooden crucifix, a scrap of embroidered vestment, a single page torn from a banned prayer book. Groups met in secret, not to plan rebellion, but simply to sit together, to share warmth, to reassure one another that not everything sacred had been taken. While Edward's council restructured religion and power like pieces on a chessboard, the people lived in the cracks left behind. Their suffering did not appear in the king's journal. Their grief never reached the marble halls of the palace. But in the cottages, the fields, and the dim corners of England's villages, men and women carried the weight of a reign that reshaped every breath they took, not through argument or theology, but through the quiet ache of everyday life transformed into fear. To understand why such a short reign could unleash so much cruelty, one must look directly at Edward himself. He was not a monster born from some innate darkness. He was a child shaped, crafted, moulded with deliberate precision by the adults who surrounded him. A boy physically fragile, yet spiritually hardened far beyond his years. A child taught not how to feel, but how to judge. From the beginning, Edward's health had been delicate. He caught illnesses easily, recovered slowly, and often appeared pale, thin, and tired. Any ordinary child with such a body would have been sheltered, nurtured, comforted. But Edward was not allowed softness. He was placed into a rigid schedule, a life built from discipline, ritual, and unyielding expectation. He rose early. He prayed. He studied languages, history, theology, statecraft. Then he prayed again. Day after day, the rhythm repeated until childhood faded into something harsher, something carved by duty rather than play. His intelligence was undeniable. Edward learned quickly, wrote clearly, and processed ideas with sharp logic. Tutors praised his memory, his discipline, his seriousness. Yet all of this brilliance was funneled into a single, narrow channel: extreme Protestant doctrine and the belief in absolute royal authority. He was never taught to see the world in layers, in complexities, in shifting shades. Instead, he learned to divide all things into two fixed categories: those aligned with God and those aligned with the devil. Catholic Mass, idolatry. The Pope, the Antichrist. Compassion for dissenters, a sin against heaven. There was no middle ground in his mind, no hesitation, no quiet space for doubt. His education was not meant to teach him understanding. It was meant to teach him certainty. His personal relationships grew distorted beneath the weight of this training. Edward had no true companions his own age. Every child placed near him existed for instruction, not friendship. They were tools, not equals. One of the few people he showed genuine affection for was Barnaby Fitzpatrick, his whipping boy, the unfortunate child, punished whenever Edward misbehaved. Edward wrote letters to Barnaby when they were separated, expressing a rare tenderness. But even this affection remained contained, never expanding to include empathy for anyone beyond his small circle. Toward the common people, toward the rebels, toward the starving, he felt nothing. Edward's journal reveals the deepest truth of his nature. He recorded everything: military campaigns, council meetings, numbers of dead, executions carried out. But the tone was always the same: steady, cool, untouched. There were no reflections on suffering, no questions about morality, no expressions of regret or internal conflict. When writing about the suppression of a rebellion, he listed the casualties in the same careful handwriting he used to record how many ships had entered harbour or how many deer had been hunted that week. Human agony became data. Those around him, tutors, counsellors, protectors, never taught him that authority could be paired with mercy. No one reminded him that kings could be compassionate, that rulers could choose patience over force. Instead, they taught that tolerating false belief was an insult to God, that sternness was virtue, that ruthlessness was divine justice in action. Inside this golden cage, Edward grew up deprived of ordinary human experiences. He never understood the warmth of true friendship, the security of love given freely, or the simple joy of childhood moments: laughter in a field, games with companions, stories told at night by someone who loved him for himself, not for his crown. He understood only obligation, doctrine, judgment, the right to command life and death. Thus, Edward became not a naturally cruel king, but a chilling one because he believed wholeheartedly that he was righteous, because he inflicted pain without ever questioning its necessity, because he had been raised to see doubt as weakness and mercy as betrayal. He was a boy shaped into a blade, sharpened by the hands of others, and set upon a kingdom that had no defense against a child who believed suffering was sacred duty. By the early months of the year 1553, Edward's frail body could endure no more. The cough that had haunted him for years deepened into something raw and relentless. His thin frame withered further, his skin turning a waxen pale, his breath growing heavy and laboured. Tuberculosis, the silent executioner of the age, had rooted itself in his lungs, consuming him inch by inch. Yet even as his strength ebbed away, Edward clung fiercely to two convictions: to hold England firmly to the Protestant faith, and to ensure that Mary Tudor never inherited the throne. Even in agony, he obsessed over the device for the succession. His handwriting trembled, letters wavering like shadows, but his intent remained sharp. He summoned lawyers, judges, and nobles, urging, sometimes nearly commanding them to endorse the altered succession. Every mark of ink, every added phrase, every correction came from the mind of a dying boy, determined to shape the future beyond his own life. He believed that if he could secure a Protestant heir, he would preserve what he called the true faith, even after death. During his most painful hours, Protestant chaplains stood beside him, offering comfort shaped not from mercy, but from ideology. They told him he was a martyr for the true religion, that his suffering was holy, that God was preparing a special place for him. Edward held on to these assurances as his body failed him, as nights stretched long and breath came shorter. On the 6th day of July, in the year 1553, Edward died at Greenwich Palace. He was only 15 years old. According to those present, his final words were a prayer, asking God to defend the realm and protect the Protestant faith. In death, as in life, he believed utterly that righteousness and suffering were bound together. The news of his death did not immediately reach the people. For 2 days, it was hidden concealed behind palace walls so that John Dudley, now Duke of Northumberland, could prepare to proclaim Lady Jane Grey as Queen. Edward's last political act, shaped in trembling ink, was set into motion. Lady Jane Grey reigned for 9 days. Then Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Catholic by conviction and beloved by many who resented the years of forced reform, gathered supporters and marched toward her birthright. The people rallied to her. Nobles shifted allegiance. Northumberland's power crumbled almost overnight. Jane was deposed without a true battle, her crown slipping away like morning mist. Northumberland was executed. Jane Grey, the young woman Edward had elevated, was removed from the throne and later taken to the scaffold. The world Edward fought to create a permanently Protestant England collapsed in mere weeks after his death. Mary ascended the throne as Mary I, restoring Catholicism with fiery determination. The Protestant persecutions began. Burnings, imprisonments, and executions. In her mind, she was righting heresy. In truth, she was continuing the cycle of violence that Edward's reign had sharpened. The pendulum swung back, but the wounds remained. Some of Edward's policies were reversed. Latin returned to the Mass. Catholic clerics reclaimed their positions. But the deeper damage could not be undone. Parish churches stripped of centuries-old art remained bare. Chantry lands, once seized, were never returned. Communities broken by enclosure did not magically reappear. The thousands who died under Edward's laws could not be restored to life. The hatred that lingered, the religious bitterness that Edward had inflamed, burned hotter under Mary. Violence had been sown during his reign, and it sprouted again in hers, creating a cycle that would shape England for generations. By the cold measure of goals achieved, Edward's reign was a failure. He did not secure the succession he wanted. He did not make Protestantism unshakable. He did not shape the future in the way he imagined. But by the measure of wounds inflicted, Edward's rule was something far more lasting. A deep cut carved into the spirit of England, a wound that would ache through Mary's reign, echo under Elizabeth's rule, and shadow the kingdom long after the boy king's brief, brittle life had faded away. After Edward's death, many in his own time found it tempting to dismiss his reign as a brief historical accident, a dark interlude caused by the misfortune of a boy king surrounded by ruthless men. But the suffering of those 6 years did not vanish when his heartbeat stopped. The policies he approved, the decrees issued in his name, and the punishments carried out under his authority, planted the seeds of a century of religious conflict that England would struggle to escape. Under Edward, a precedent had been created that a monarch could seize the realm's spiritual life, reshape it according to doctrine, and enforce obedience not through persuasion, but through law, violence, and fear. Once that door was opened, it would not close again. Mary, who came after him, burned Protestants, just as Edward had burned Catholics. Elizabeth would later hang and disembowel Catholic priests as if completing a grim cycle. All 3 monarchs believed they acted for God. And though each carried different convictions, the gateway that allowed faith to become a weapon had been unlocked during Edward's short rule. Once a nation learns it can punish belief, every sovereign who follows inherits the same terrible tool. The social and economic changes born under Edward also proved irreversible. Enclosure, the fencing of common land, continued to spread. Entire communities of small farmers shrank into a new class of landless labourers, dependent solely on wages, vulnerable to hunger, and unable to rely on any safety net. The monasteries that had once fed the starving, taught the young, and tended the sick were gone forever. Even when Mary attempted to restore Catholicism, she could not rebuild what Edward's regime had shattered. The lands had already passed into the hands of new nobles. The holy vessels were melted. The church bells lay as shapeless metal. Ancient manuscripts had burned into ash. No royal decree, no matter how determined, could summon back centuries of tradition once scattered by fire and greed. What Edward and his counsellors destroyed was not merely wealth, but memory, cultural memory, spiritual memory. The memory of a shared past, shaped through rituals, songs, stained glass, carvings, and the steady faith of generations. England shifted from churches glowing with colour to pale, stripped spaces echoing with absence. Landscapes once filled with chantries, shrines, painted saints, and ritual music were emptied. The connection between ordinary people and their ancestors woven through art and liturgy was severed. Historians still speak of this loss as one of the greatest cultural catastrophes in English history. The 6 years of Edward's reign, brief as they were, bent England onto a new path that no monarch after him could straighten. The country would never return to what it had been, not in religion, not in community life, not in art, not in its understanding of its own past. Instead of a unified land, it became one divided by doctrine, living with deep suspicion and long memories of betrayal. Instead of a society supported by monastic charity and communal structures, it became one reliant on fragile wages and harsher systems of control. Instead of a culture rooted in the ancient beauty of handcrafted devotion, it lived with blank walls and the echo of what had been lost. Edward's reign did not last long, but its shadow stretched far. His decisions, or the decisions made through him, reached forward into the lives of Mary, Elizabeth, and the generations beyond. The pain endured in his time etched itself into England's identity, and the aftershocks shaped the nation not just for a few years, but for an era. 6 years created a wound that would not heal easily, a wound carved into the kingdom's faith, economy, memory, and soul. When we look back on the reign of Edward VI, the greatest question is not simply what he did, but how responsible he truly was. Some argue that he was only a child, shaped and used by Somerset and Northumberland, driven along paths he never chose. And there is truth in that. The adults surrounding him crafted him into a symbol of extreme reform, fed him hatred as if it were knowledge, and wrapped his fragile sense of self in the shimmering armor of divine pride. But to say Edward was innocent is not accurate. He was not a mindless puppet. His diary, precise, observant, unwavering in tone, makes this clear. Edward understood what was happening, and often responded with a chilling eagerness. He signed the warrant for his uncle's execution. He approved the crushing of the Devon-Cornwall rebels. He authorized the confiscation of church property. He sanctioned burnings, hangings, and the dismemberment of those condemned as heretics. And some of the harshest, most unforgiving reforms of his reign were impelled forward by his own conviction, not forced upon him by counsellors. And yet, Edward was also undeniably the product of a distorted world. From his earliest breath, he was told he had been chosen by God, that his judgments were divine will, that to oppose him was to oppose heaven, that the Catholic faith, the faith that had shaped England for nearly 1,000 years, was a wickedness that must be purged. Growing up in such a climate, he was never taught doubt. He was never taught compassion. He was never taught the quiet strength of listening to others. He was not permitted to play freely, to make ordinary mistakes, or to form natural friendships. His childhood was a construction, precise, narrow, suffocating. Children need affection to learn empathy. Edward did not receive it. Children need to witness gentleness in order to grow gentle themselves. Edward was shown only power and devotion, severity and doctrine. His world was built of stone, not touch, obedience, not curiosity, certainty, not tenderness. The adults around him, tutors, counselors, clerics, all reinforced the same message, that mercy toward false belief was an insult to God, that punishment was duty, that violence could be holy. In this environment, Edward never learned to question the righteousness of suffering. He never saw kindness modeled by those in authority. He never learned that leadership could mean anything other than judgment, and so his humanity withered quietly, long before his body did. He lost his childhood before he ever had the chance to understand its shape. And when childhood is stolen, something else is often stolen too, the part of the soul that understands softness, patience, and forgiveness. So was Edward a villain, or was he a victim? Perhaps he was both. He was a child led into darkness, and then became a conduit through which that darkness spread to others. He bore responsibility, real responsibility for choices he made with a clear, unwavering hand. But he also bore the deep scars of an upbringing that denied him the foundations of ordinary humanity. History rarely divides cleanly into good and evil, and Edward VI does not belong in either category. He occupies a grey, unsettling space, a space created by power, fear, faith, and childhood, twisted into something far too sharp. To understand him, we must look slowly, gently, and honestly at that greyness. For in it lies the truth of a boy who believed he was serving God, even as he opened wounds that would take generations to close. When people speak of the reign of Edward VI, they usually recall the great clashes of doctrine or the intricate power struggles within the court. They speak of Somerset and Northumberland, of laws rewritten, of churches stripped bare. But the true cost of those years was paid not by councillors or nobles, but by the nameless, the ones who died without monuments, without records, without a place in the chronicles of kings. They were the quiet heart of England, yet history let them slip into shadow. First came the ones who burned. They were not villains, no matter how fiercely propaganda painted them. They were aging parish priests who had served their communities for decades. Monks who had once tended gardens, copied manuscripts, taught children. Ordinary women like Joan of Kent, whose only crime was refusing to abandon the prayers she had whispered since childhood. They clung to Latin not out of rebellion, but out of devotion, believing with simple faith that the familiar words carried them closer to God. And for this, they were tied to wooden stakes, surrounded by bundles of kindling, and burned alive while crowds were forced to watch. Their voices, hoarse with smoke, cracking with pain, were swallowed by fire long before their stories were ever written down. Then came the rebels, the farmers and labourers who rose in desperation from Devon and Cornwall, from Norfolk, and the ransacked villages affected by enclosure. They did not seek to topple the Tudor throne. They did not dream of replacing kings. They only wanted land enough to plough, enough grain to eat, enough stability to live beside their church and their ancestors' graves. They wanted the mass that had marked the rhythm of their lives. They wanted the traditions that had comforted their parents and grandparents. For daring to hold on to these small human hopes, they were hunted down by foreign mercenaries, cut down in fields and streets, their bodies left as warnings. Thousands died beneath weapons wielded by men who did not speak their language, and did not see them as neighbours, but only as obstacles. Next came the ones who starved. These deaths did not happen because of drought or plague, but because of policy. When common lands were fenced away, when monasteries, the ancient safety net of England, were dismantled, when grain prices rose and wages collapsed, there was nowhere left for the poor to turn. The old and the young perished first. Infants grew silent in their mothers' arms. Children collapsed in the dust beside roadsides. Entire families withered quietly in abandoned barns or hedgerows. Their graves were shallow. Sometimes they had none at all. Records from the era contain small, chilling notes. A body found beyond the river. A child dead at the roadside. Nothing more. Their lives ended without remark, without ceremony. There were the craftsmen, 2 men who had learned their trade from guilds passed down through generations. When these guilds were dissolved under Edward's religious policies, the weavers, smiths, carpenters, and stonemasons lost not only their employment, but their identity, their community, their guarantee of support during hard seasons. Many drifted into poverty, unmoored from the structure that had once given them dignity. There were the poor students who lost their schools when chantry endowments were seized. Bright children whose only hope at rising in the world came from a few coins of charity or a place in a chantry-funded classroom. When those institutions vanished, the doors to education closed for them forever. There were the sick, who once found care in monastic infirmaries, now shuttered. Some died from illnesses that could once have been soothed. Others wandered in search of help that no longer existed. There were the widows, women who had depended on parish charity or the benevolence of the church to survive. With those supports stripped away, many were left to starve, or to beg, or to disappear quietly into the corners of the countryside. None of these losses are captured by numbers alone. They were lives interrupted, families torn apart, hopes extinguished without witness. They formed the hidden landscape of Edward's reign, the part not discussed in councils or recorded in royal journals. There are no statues for them, no plaques, no noble tombs. But if one wishes to understand the true nature of Edward VI's England, one must look toward these silent people, the ones who lacked power, who lacked voice, who lacked defenders, the ones who never had the chance to explain themselves before judgment descended. For in their absence, in the empty spaces they left behind, lies the truest portrait of those 6 years. Not a portrait of kings and councillors, but a portrait of grief etched into a nation that was never allowed to heal. As we drift away from the last shadows of Edward's brief and troubled reign, let the images you've held in your mind begin to soften, as though someone was slowly drawing a gentle curtain of mist across them. The noise of rebellion, the crackle of flame, the cold corridors of the palace, the weary breath of a dying boy, let all of it grow quieter now, fainter, like distant echoes dissolving into the night. Take a slow breath with me, because history, even when harsh, has a way of reminding us of something tender, that behind every great event are human hearts, fragile and searching, sometimes misguided, sometimes afraid, always shaped by the hands around them. Edward VI was both a symbol of cruelty and a victim of it. A child raised to see the world through a single narrow window, never taught how to open the others. And perhaps that is where the quiet message of his story lies. That without compassion, power becomes a blade. That without guidance rooted in kindness, even a young heart can be hardened. That when a society forgets its most vulnerable, something precious in all of us begins to fade. But it also teaches us something hopeful. That we are the ones who break the cycles we inherit, and we are the ones who choose which beliefs, which kindnesses, which memories to carry forward. So as the last traces of this history slip into the soft darkness, allow yourself to feel the weight of the story releasing slowly, gently, like sand falling through an open hand. Let your mind wander away from the sorrow, and toward the quiet truth that every ending holds space for rest and for renewal. You've walked through centuries tonight, through fire and fear and fragile humanity, and now your place is here in the calm, in the hush, in the warmth waiting beneath your eyelids. Let the images fade. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts settle like dust under a closing book. And hear this, just as softly as I can offer it. You are safe now. You are here, and the night is ready to hold you. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. Thank you for listening, for feeling, for remembering those history has forgotten. May your sleep be deep, peaceful, and kind to your heart. Good night, my friend, and don't forget to subscribe so you can be here with us again for the next story, the next dream, the next soft passage through time.